In the making of the story I Am Ben Hall, the story behind the Bushranger, we wanted to take you to where Ben Hall's hut or homestead once stood. It's really important to us that in the production of any of these stories, we take you to where it happened to the best of our knowledge at the time. And this story was going to be no different. But what we knew was that no one really agreed on where Ben Hall's homestead was. There's a couple of sites that were being considered, but no one can agree on which one's which. So what we did is we pulled up the plans for Sandy Creek to try to get an idea where things were at the time. We pulled up all the descriptions of anybody that went to Ben Hall's place and wrote it down in the diary. We wanted to have a look at that information to see whether they described Ben Hall's location. That gave us an inkling of where it might have been. And we went and spoke to all the landowners around there and get their feeling of what they thought was Ben Hall's homestead site. And that led us to uncovering these artefacts. Now, there were bed heads, bed frames, there were stoves, and there was a whole pile of glass. But what we had to do is we had to take that information away and get it authenticated to understand whether this actually could have belonged to Ben Hall or come from that era of 1860. So let's start with the bedsteads, as they called them in those days, but they're actually bed heads and bed frames. Were they available in the colony in Ben Hall's time in 1860? Yes, they were. There's a number of advertisements in the Trove saying that people were advertising iron bed heads. But when we spoke to antique dealers, they said that they were common and cheap, even in 1860. So no one's done a lot of work, even to this very day, to try to date them, because they were common and cheap then, and they're pretty common to easily found now and not that expensive. So there's been a lot of work in them. So can we prove that these bed heads belonged to Ben Hall, or were they of the right era? Well, not really. The only thing one antique dealer said to me was that this is probably early Victorian, and that makes it in the right era, because they used to have a double ridge here and then a double ridge there in the later part. So he said that could easily be early Victorian, but that was the only inkling we had. So in essence, there's absolutely no way of proving that these bed frames, bed heads, bedsteads were even of the right era for Ben Hall. What about the stoves? So that brings us to the second part, and that is the stoves. We recovered two major pieces of evidence on these stoves. This is a premium stove. You can read the word premium. Under there, it's a bit harder, but some research says that there were Eastern premium stoves imported to the colony at the right period in the 1850s. So this piece of stove could have easily come from the right era. On a second visit to the site, we recovered another stove frame, which says Stove Works number 8. Now, we also did some research behind that, and we've discovered that these stoves were definitely available in the colony in Ben Hall's era. So could these have belonged to Ben Hall? Absolutely, because they're of the right dating. But did they belong to Ben Hall? Absolutely no way of knowing. So when you start talking to people who do research on colonial sites all the time, they say they use glass, because glass had very discrete periods in time of its manufacture and style, where this sort of stuff doesn't. So what we did is we reverted to looking at the glass to try to date the site. So this leads us to the glass and how to date the site. Well, according to the experts, white crockery was universal, used for over a very long period of time and cannot be used to date the site. This clear greeny coloured glass, again, was used over a long period of time, cannot be used to date the site. So it can all be just put aside. Similar applies to this green coloured glass. So these three piles are not useful in dating this site. So what do we have here? This is purple or amber coloured glass, purple or mauve coloured glass. It was produced in 1870 or later by adding manganese to the silica to send it clear. But when it's exposed to ultraviolet light, it went this colour. So this is 1870 or later, so that is not of the Ben Hall era. This amber coloured glass is probably after the turn of the century, so that's not Ben Hall era glass either. We have this square black glass. So in actual fact, it's green glass when you hold it up to the light, but they added iron slag to it to make it go this really dark colour. The square shape was only used on gin and schnapps bottles that come from Holland and Germany. The fact there's no markings on the bottom of that bottle suggests that it could be around 1850 or even earlier. So this black glass could have been around at Ben Hall's time. That leads us to the crockery with colour on it. And this cornflower blue was the first colours that were added to crockery, according to the experts, in the early 1800s, 1820, 1830. And it continued on adding different colours up until 1860 of greens and browns. And then by the turn of the century, it went into the real ornate Royal Dalton type colours you see. So when we're going over the site, we found one little piece which has written on the back, W-H-G-R-E-N-G. Doing some research behind that, it's W.H. Grindley of England. He was a pottery maker in 1880. So that suggests, this piece at least, is definitely after Ben Hall's era. So in summary, what do we know? Well, that's not to say any of this wasn't used by Ben Hall, but it strongly suggests that most of this site was used after Ben Hall's era or is contaminated by people leaving stuff there. Is this the right Ben Hall site? We're very confident we got it right, and we have been supported in that theory by archaeologists, historians and renowned authors who have contacted us and said, yep, you got the right site, but the stuff on that site is probably a much later era. And they did suggest 1880s, and I think they're absolutely right. I think most of this stuff is of that era. That's not to say that some of this stuff couldn't have been used by Ben Hall. The reason we can say the site is, we're confident with this site, is that in the story I Am Ben Hall, we go through some statements that were provided by police. We go through some diaries that were provided by police, and we look at the local history about people's recollection about where people lived in relation to each other. And that allows us to get very confident that we know where Ben Hall at least lived in relationship to everybody else, and hone in on where this site was to gain some confidence. And if you want to understand how we did that, it's all told in the story I Am Ben Hall, the story behind the Bushranger.